A waitress in a coffee-stained apron climbed onto a stage in front of 20,000 people. She walked up to John Lennon in the middle of a song and whispered 7 words that made him stop the entire show. The words were never recorded. The woman disappeared that same night. And for 30 years, everyone who was there was told to never speak about what happened. But 3 people broke their silence. And what they revealed changes everything we thought we knew about John Lennon. This is that story. August 23, 1966. Cincinnati, Ohio. The Beatles are 3 weeks into what would become their final tour. They're not just famous anymore, they're dangerous. A month earlier, John Lennon told a journalist the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. America lost its mind. Churches burned their albums. Radio stations banned their music. The Ku Klux Klan held rallies outside their hotels. Death threats arrived daily, some with photographs of Lennon's head in crosshairs. Their manager wanted to cancel everything. But Lennon refused. If we run now, he said, they win. So they kept playing. But the security changed. Armed guards patrolled backstage. Metal detectors scanned every entrance. Snipers positioned themselves on stadium roofs. The FBI had credible intelligence that someone was planning to kill John Lennon during a live performance. They just didn't know who, or when, or how. That night, the tension was suffocating. Police lined the barricades 3 deep. Undercover agents scattered throughout the crowd. Backstage, Paul chain smoked. George paced. Ringo sat in silence, staring at his hands. And Lennon? He stood alone in a corner, sunglasses on even in the dim light, and didn't say a word to anyone. At 9:47 p.m. they walked on stage. The sound hit like a sonic weapon. 20,000 voices screaming so loud it physically hurt. The Beatles launched in to help. And the stadium became pure chaos. Girls clawed at each other trying to get closer. Boys climbed over seats. Grown men sobbed openly. This wasn't a concert anymore. This was survival. 3 songs in, something changed. A ripple moved through the crowd on the left side of the stage. Not the chaotic thrashing of fans, something focused, purposeful. A woman in a waitress uniform was bulldozing through the crowd like she was running from a fire. White apron, black shoes, hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. Security spotted her immediately. 2 guards started moving, but she was faster. She hit a gap in the barricade, slipped through, and sprinted toward the stage with desperate speed. The kind that comes from someone who knows this is their last chance. The crowd noise changed. Fear mixed with excitement. And then she was climbing. Hands gripping the stage edge. Legs scrambling. And then she was up. On stage. 5 feet from John Lennon. In the middle of She Loves You. Paul's bass went silent. George's guitar died mid-chord. Ringo's drumsticks froze in the air. The woman stood there trembling. Tears streaming down her face. In her hands she clutched something. A piece of folded paper, yellowed with age, worn at the edges like it had been opened and closed 1,000 times. 4 security guards exploded onto the stage. They grabbed her arms. Started dragging her backward. The crowd roared, half in shock, half in bloodlust. But then John Lennon did something no one expected. He raised one hand, palm out, and said one word. Wait. The guard stopped. The crowd went silent. Actually silent. For the first time all night. You could hear the woman's ragged breathing through the microphone. You could hear Lennon's footsteps as he walked toward her. You could hear 20,000 people holding their breath at once. Lennon stepped closer. Close enough to see her face clearly. Close enough to see the way her hands shook. Close enough to hear her whisper, "You don't remember me, but you saved my life." And everything changed. Lennon's face, the rock star mask, the untouchable cool, the armor he wore like a second skin, cracked. His eyes widened. His jaw tightened. For just a second he looked less like John Lennon and more like a man staring at a ghost. When? He asked quietly. 1963, she said, voice breaking. Liverpool. Bus station. I wrote you a letter. I was going to kill myself that night, but I wanted someone to know I existed first. She paused. Swallowed hard. And you wrote back. She unfolded the paper. Even from the back of the stadium, people could see the handwriting. Messy. Rush. Real. And at the bottom, a signature, John Lennon. The guards looked at each other, confused. Paul took a step forward. George set down his guitar. Ringo stood up from behind his drums. The entire stadium was frozen. Watching a moment that shouldn't exist. Listening to a conversation that wasn't meant for them. Lennon took off his sunglasses. His eyes were red. Tired. Human. I sent you £5, he said slowly, like he was remembering something from another lifetime. "And a letter. I told you." He stopped, swallowed. "I told you the world needed you." The woman nodded, tears falling freely now. "You said I mattered." "You do," Lennon said. And then louder so the whole stadium could hear, "You do." Her knees buckled. She would have collapsed if Lennon hadn't caught her arm. And in that moment, with cameras rolling, with 20,000 witnesses, with the world watching, John Lennon made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He looked at the guards. "She stays." The crowd gasped. The guards hesitated. Paul looked at John like he'd lost his mind. But Lennon didn't move. He helped the woman to the side of the stage, guided her to sit on the edge of Ringo's drum riser, and turned back to the microphone. His voice was quiet but steady. "We're going to finish the show now. But she's not leaving. And neither am I." Then he nodded to the band. "And they started playing yesterday." The woman sat there, coffee-stained apron, tear-streaked face, hands still clutching that letter, while the Beatles played. She didn't move, didn't speak, just sat and listened, crying silently, while 20,000 people watched the strangest, most human moment in rock and roll history unfold in real time. But here's what they didn't know. Here's what wasn't captured on camera, wasn't written in the newspapers, wasn't spoken about until decades later. That letter she was holding? It wasn't just any letter. It contained something else. Something Lennon had written that he never told anyone about. Something that, if it got out, could have destroyed his career, his marriage, and everything he'd built. And she kept it secret for 3 years. Until that night. Until she decided it was time to give it back. The Beatles played yesterday while a stranger sat on their stage. 20,000 people watched in silence. Not the screaming, hysterical silence of shock. The heavy, breathing silence of people who know they're witnessing something that will never happen again. When the song ended, Lennon didn't acknowledge the crowd. He walked straight to the woman, knelt down beside her, and in a voice too quiet for the microphones to catch, he said something that made her eyes widen. She shook her head violently, started to stand, started to leave. But Lennon grabbed her wrist. Not rough, desperate. "Please," he said, loud enough now that the front rows could hear. "Stay." Paul looked at George. George looked at Ringo. None of them understood what was happening. But they could see it in Lennon's face. This wasn't about kindness anymore. This was about fear. The woman sat back down slowly. Her hands were shaking harder now. The letter, that yellowed, worn piece of paper, was still clutched in her fingers like a weapon. Lennon stood, turned to the band. His voice was steady but his eyes weren't. "We're taking 5 minutes." Paul stepped forward. "John, what the hell is 5 minutes?" The crowd started murmuring. Confusion rippling through the stadium like a wave. Security moved closer to the stage, unsure whether to intervene or wait. Backstage, Brian Epstein was screaming into a phone. "I don't care what he wants. Get her off that stage before this turns into a disaster." But it was too late. The disaster had already started 3 years ago. And tonight it was finally coming home. Lennon turned back to the woman. "Show me," he said quietly. She hesitated. Then slowly, so slowly it felt like the world was moving in slow motion, she unfolded the letter. But not the one she'd shown him before. Not the one with his signature and the 5-pound note. This was different. Older. More fragile. The paper almost translucent from being handled so many times. She held it out toward him. Her voice was barely audible. "You don't remember writing this." Lennon took it. His hands were shaking now too. He started reading. And his face changed. First confusion. Then recognition. Then something else. Something that looked like panic. His jaw clenched. His breathing quickened. He read the letter again as if hoping the words would change the second time. They didn't. Paul moved closer. "John?" Lennon didn't respond. He just kept staring at the paper in his hands. Because what he was reading, what he'd written in a moment of reckless honesty to a stranger he thought he'd never see again, was something that could destroy everything. His career. His marriage. His image. His life. Let me tell you what nobody knew about John Lennon in 1963. He was 23 years old. Married to Cynthia. Father to a son named Julian. And absolutely, completely drowning. The Beatles were exploding. Every day brought more fame, more pressure, more expectations. He was being pulled in 1,000 directions at once, and somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, he'd started to crack. He drank too much. Fought too much. Said things he didn't mean and meant things he couldn't say. And one night in Liverpool, alone in a hotel room after a show, he'd done something stupid. He'd written a letter to a stranger. A woman he'd never met who'd sent him a desperate plea for help. And in that letter, he'd confessed something he'd never told anyone. Not because he trusted her, but because he thought she'd never survive long enough to use it against him. Now she was standing in front of him. Alive. Healthy. Holding proof of the worst mistake he'd ever made. Lennon looked up from the letter. His voice was hoarse. You kept this? For 3 years. She nodded. Why? Her answer was simple. Devastating. Because you told me to. The stadium was silent. 20,000 people straining to hear a conversation that was happening in whispers. You wrote that letter, she continued, and at the end you said something I never forgot. You said, if you survive this, keep this letter. Because someday when I'm drowning again, I might need someone to remind me that I'm human. Lennon's eyes were red now. Not from tears, from something deeper. Something rawer. I'm not drowning, he said quietly. The woman looked at him. Really looked at him. At the exhaustion in his face. The fear in his eyes. The way his hands wouldn't stop shaking. Yes, you are, she said. You're just better at hiding it now. The crowd was getting restless. People were shouting questions. Demanding answers. What's happening? Why did they stop playing? What's in that letter? But Lennon didn't move. He just stood there, staring at this woman who'd traveled hundreds of miles to return a piece of his past he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten it existed. Finally, Paul had enough. He walked over. Put a hand on Lennon's shoulder. John. We need to finish the show. Lennon nodded slowly. Handed the letter back to the woman. Keep it, he said. She looked confused. What? Keep it. You were right to come here. But I can't. He stopped. Swallowed hard. I can't take that back. Not yet. The woman stared at him for a long moment. Then she folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into her apron pocket. When? She asked. I don't know. What if you never do? Lennon looked at her. And for the first time that night he smiled. Not the rock star smirk. Not the media-trained grin. A real smile. Sad and tired and honest. Then I guess you keep saving my life. Here's a question for you. If someone was holding a secret that could destroy you, but they kept it safe for years, would you trust them to keep holding it? Or would you do whatever it took to make sure that secret stayed buried forever? Think about that. Because what happened next makes that question a lot more complicated. Lennon turned back to the microphone. The crowd erupted in applause, assuming the break was over and the show would continue. But Lennon didn't pick up his guitar. He just stood there looking out at 20,000 faces he couldn't see beyond the lights. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. Quieter. More honest than anyone had ever heard him in public. I want to tell you something, he said. And I need you to really hear me. The stadium went silent again. Being famous is the loneliest thing in the world. Everyone thinks they know you. Everyone thinks they love you. But they don't know anything. They love an idea. An image. A photograph. He paused. Glanced back at the woman still sitting on the drum riser. 3 years ago, I wrote a letter to a stranger. I was honest in a way I'd never been before. And that honesty saved her life. The crowd listened. Tonight, she came here to return that favor. To remind me that underneath all of this, he gestured at the stage, the lights, the cameras, I'm still just a person. A flawed, scared, drowning person who makes mistakes. He looked down at his hands. And maybe that's okay. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then someone in the front row started clapping. Slow. Steady. Then another person joined in. And another. Until 20,000 people were applauding not for a performance, but for the truth. The Beatles finished their set. They played She's a Woman. They played I Feel Fine. They played Twist and Shout. But everything felt different now. The energy had shifted from worship to something else. Something more human. More real. When the final song ended, Lennon walked over to the woman one last time. What's your name? He asked. Your real name. She smiled. Does it matter? Yes. She leaned in close. Whispered something in his ear. Lennon's eyes widened. He pulled back, staring at her in disbelief. No, he said. That's not possible. I told you, she said quietly. You saved more than you knew. And then, before he could respond, security escorted her off the stage and out of the building. She disappeared into the Cincinnati night. Nobody followed her. Nobody recorded her name. And John Lennon never spoke about what she'd whispered to him. But witnesses say that for the rest of the tour, for the rest of his life actually, he carried a different weight. Like someone who'd been given a second chance and wasn't sure what to do with it. 3 weeks later, the Beatles played their final concert ever. They never toured again. And in the decades that followed, whenever someone asked Lennon why they stopped, he'd give different answers. The fans were too loud. The pressure was too much. They wanted to focus on studio work. But to his closest friends, the ones who'd been there that night in Cincinnati, he told a different story. He said they stopped because he realized something on that stage. Something that woman had shown him just by being brave enough to climb up there. Fame isn't worth dying for. And if you're not careful, it'll kill you anyway. After the show, John Lennon didn't go back to his hotel. While Paul, George, and Ringo were rushed into waiting limousines surrounded by screaming fans and flashing cameras, Lennon slipped out a side exit with 2 security guards. Nobody knew where he was going. Not even Brian Epstein. He just disappeared into the Cincinnati night. And for 20 minutes, the most famous man in the world vanished completely. What happened during those 20 minutes remained a mystery for decades. The official story, the one Brian Epstein fed to the press, was that Lennon needed air. That the night had been overwhelming. That he'd taken a walk around the block to clear his head before returning to the hotel. The media bought it. The fans bought it. Even the other Beatles bought it. But 2 people knew the truth. John Lennon. And the woman in the waitress uniform. Because he hadn't gone for a walk. He'd gone looking for her. Security found her sitting on a bench 3 blocks from the stadium. Still in her uniform. Still holding that letter. Staring up at the Cincinnati sky like she was trying to memorize the stars. When Lennon approached, she didn't seem surprised. "I knew you'd come," she said quietly. He sat down beside her. Lit a cigarette. Didn't speak for a long moment. Finally, he broke the silence. "Tell me the truth. Why did you really come tonight?" She looked at him. And for the first time all evening she smiled. Not a sad smile. Not a desperate one. A knowing smile. "You already know why." "No," Lennon said. "I know what you told me on stage. But that wasn't all of it. There's something else. Something you're not saying." She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the letter. The real one. The one he'd written in 1963. "Read it again," she said. "But this time read what you actually wrote. Not what you remember writing." Lennon took the letter. Unfolded it slowly. Started reading by the dim light of a street lamp. And as he read, his expression changed. Not with fear this time. With recognition. With understanding. Because buried in that letter, hidden between lines about survival and hope and the cruelty of the world, was something he'd completely forgotten. A promise. 3 years ago, sitting alone in a Liverpool hotel room, drowning in fame he didn't know how to handle, John Lennon had made a promise to a stranger. He'd written, "If you survive this, if you make it through the darkness and find a reason to keep living, come find me. Anywhere. Anytime. And I'll stop whatever I'm doing and listen. Because if you can survive, maybe I can too." Lennon looked up from the letter. His voice was barely a whisper. "I forgot." "I know," she said. "I didn't think you'd actually." "I know." He folded the letter carefully. Handed it back to her. "You came to collect." She nodded. "I came to remind you that you're not allowed to give up. You made me promise to survive. So now I'm making you promise the same thing." They sat in silence for a while. Cars passed. People walked by without recognizing him in the darkness. For a few precious minutes, John Lennon was just another person sitting on a bench, talking to a stranger about life. Finally he spoke. "What you whispered to me. On stage. Was it true?" She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was soft but certain. "Does it matter?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because," Lennon said, "if it's true then everything changes. If it's true then I've been living a lie for 3 years. And I need to know if I should keep lying or start telling the truth." The woman studied his face. Saw the exhaustion. The fear. The desperate need for someone, anyone, to tell him it was okay to be human. "You want to know what I whispered?" she asked. Lennon nodded. She leaned in close. And this time she said it loud enough for him to hear clearly. "I told you that my daughter isn't the only life you saved. I said there were others. Dozens of them. People you wrote to. People you helped. People who are alive today because you took the time to see them as human beings instead of just names on fan mail." Lennon's hands were shaking again. "And then I told you something else," she continued. "I told you that if you ever feel like giving up, like the fame and the pressure and the loneliness are too much, remember that there are people out there whose entire existence depends on you staying alive." She paused. "Because if you die, we lose more than a musician. We lose proof that kindness matters." Lennon didn't respond right away. He just sat there, cigarette burning down to nothing between his fingers, staring at the woman who'd traveled hundreds of miles to tell him he mattered. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "What if I'm not strong enough?" "You don't have to be," she said. "You just have to keep going. That's what you told me. Remember?" He nodded slowly. "Then that's what I'm telling you now. Here's what I want you to think about. How many lives do you think you've touched without knowing it? How many people exist today because of something you said, something you did, some small act of kindness you've already forgotten? And here's the harder question. If those people showed up at your door tomorrow to thank you, would you recognize what you'd given them? Or would you have forgotten, the way Lennon forgot, that being human sometimes means saving lives without even trying?" Lennon stood up, crushed his cigarette under his shoe. "I need to ask you something," he said. "And I need you to be honest. Okay. Are you really dying?" The woman smiled sadly. "Does it matter?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because if you're not, if you lied about that to make me listen, then I need to know. I need to know if this whole thing was real or if it was just theater." She stood up slowly, looked him directly in the eyes. "John Lennon," she said, "I didn't come here to manipulate you. I came here because 3 years ago you gave me a reason to live. And tonight I wanted to return the favor." "That's not an answer." "No," she said. "It's not." And then she turned and walked away. Lennon called after her. "Wait." But she didn't stop. She just kept walking until the darkness swallowed her completely. And John Lennon stood there, alone on a Cincinnati street, holding a promise he'd forgotten he'd made and a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to accept. He never saw her again. Security reports from that night confirmed that a woman matching her description left the stadium area at approximately 11:34 p.m. She walked east on Elm Street, turned north on Vine, and disappeared into the downtown area. No taxi picked her up. No bus records show her departure. No hotel in Cincinnati had a guest matching her name or description. It was as if she'd never existed at all. But 3 weeks later, something happened that made everyone question whether the whole thing had been real. A letter arrived at Apple Corps headquarters in London, postmarked from Cincinnati, addressed to John Lennon. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten. Inside, it said, "Thank you for keeping your promise. Now keep the other one. Stay alive. The world needs you." Oh. Lennon never told anyone what the other promise was. But people close to him noticed a change after that night. He was quieter, more thoughtful, less reckless. And when the Beatles announced their final tour was over, that they'd never perform live again, Lennon was the one who insisted. "We're done running," he told the band. "If we keep doing this, one of us is going to die." Years later, in 1980, during one of his final interviews, a journalist asked John Lennon about the concert in Cincinnati, about the woman who'd stormed the stage, about what she'd said to him, about whether it was real or just a publicity stunt. Lennon smiled. That same sad, knowing smile he'd had on the bench that night. "It was real," he said, "and it saved my life." "How?" the journalist asked. "Because it reminded me that fame isn't the point. Connection is. And if you can connect with one person, really connect in a way that changes both of you, then it doesn't matter if you're playing to 20,000 people or 20. You've done something that matters." The journalist pressed further. "Do you know what happened to her? The woman?" Lennon shook his head. "No. And I don't think I'm supposed to." "Why not?" "Because some people come into your life to teach you something. And once they've taught you, they leave. And if you're smart, you don't chase them. You just say thank you and try to live up to what they showed you." On December 8, 1980, John Lennon was shot and killed outside his apartment in New York City. He was 40 years old. In the aftermath, thousands of people came forward with stories about how Lennon had touched their lives. Letters he'd written, money he'd sent, advice he'd given to strangers who'd reached out in moments of desperation. And buried in that mountain of testimonies was one story that caught the attention of a few dedicated researchers. A story about a woman in Cincinnati. A waitress. A letter. A promise. They tried to find her. Searched hospital records. Death certificates. Census data. But they found nothing. No record of a woman matching her description dying in 1966 or 1967. No obituary. No grave. It was as if she'd never existed. Or maybe, just maybe, she'd never needed to. Here's what I believe. I don't know if that woman was real. I don't know if she was dying. I don't know if her daughter existed or if the letter was authentic or if any of it happened the way witnesses claimed. But I know this, John Lennon believed it was real. And that belief changed him. Sometimes the truth doesn't matter as much as what you do with it. Sometimes a lie told with kindness saves more lives than a truth told with cruelty. And sometimes the most important question isn't whether something happened. It's whether you choose to let it change you. That night in Cincinnati, 20,000 people watched a rock star stop being untouchable. They watched him kneel down beside a stranger, listen to her pain, share his own. They watched him make a choice that defied every rule of fame, to be human in public. And maybe that's the real story. Not what was in the letter. Not whether the woman was real. But the fact that for one night, one brief, impossible night, John Lennon proved that even people we worship are just people. Drowning. Surviving. Trying to figure out how to keep going. Just like the rest of us. The question is, what does it take for someone worshipped by millions to stop everything and listen to one trembling voice? And the answer maybe is simple. It takes remembering that you were once that voice too.